Hi. So welcome to yet another session of Study Chess with me, and we'll be resuming our study of endgames with Dvoretsky. In the last video, we had finished the exercises on mind squares, and I was really happy to have solved them. But these were brute calculation, and maybe that was one of the reasons, because that's always been one of my strengths, to be honest. In this particular one, we'll be looking at triangulation, a brand new chapter. And I'll be honest with you, I've always been a little bit intimidated by the idea of triangulation. I know the concept, which is basically some rather fancy maneuvers in order to gain the opposition and therefore win the position. However, when I looked at these, and I was a much weaker chess player, I really failed to really grasp it. It just looked really complicated, and basically I was intimidated to hell. Hopefully by now I've gotten rid of these prejudices and we'll just look at these with a fresh eye and an open mind. In any case, let's take a look at what we have here. So here is the explanation based on this position by Dvoretsky himself. So triangulation refers to a king maneuver which aims to lose a tempo and leave the opponent with the move. The d5 and d7 squares here are in correspondence. The mobility of black's king is restricted. He must watch the c5, c6 break, and also avoid being pressed to the edge of the board. It's not surprising, therefore, that white can easily lose a tempo and place his opponent in zugzwang. And he says, let's press F10. Actually, it would be F11. Someone mistyped that, I assume. To play over this example. These are the shortcuts of chess-base. So, okay, so we have here, I'm going to give you basically the line that he gives, and we'll look at it together. So the winning move here is, and feel free to pause it, but we'll be looking at more examples and get to the exercises soon enough. King E5, exclamation point. And he points out very quickly that c6 would be a mistake. And the reason it would be a mistake is because after c6, not b takes c6, because obviously that would work. King c5, king d8, king d6, exclamation point, winning the opposition. King c8, king takes c6, etc. Okay. So no, after c6, what instead you would play is actually, and when I do that, it's not to be funny. It's because if you want to pause it and sort of try to find the solution, by all means. I can't. I have it right in front of me, so it is what it is. So the solution here is king c8, exclamation point. Okay. And now after king d6, king b8, getting the diagonal opposition, and of course, you can't actually play c7. It looks very nice, but it's losing. I mean, it's not losing. It loses the winning option because it will be just make a quick stalemate. So king d7, b takes c6, and so forth. Okay. And in case you're wondering, why not? Instead of king d7, if we were to play, he doesn't show it, but c7 check, king here, king c8, and you really can't do anything. I mean, if you come over here, you're not getting anything. And if you try to stay near the area, well, it's just an immediate stalemate, a stalemate. So. Okay, so king e5. King c6, and he points out that if king e7, c6 would win. Obviously. So king c6, king d4, king d7. I mean, what are you going to do? Go on to b5 and get cut off? No. King d5. And now white has achieved his aim by describing a triangle with his king. The rest is simple. King c8, king e6, king d8, king d6, and now vertical. King c8, king e7, king d7, king b8, king d7, king a8, c6. And we have achieved our aim. Nice. Okay. Okay, so here we have the first illustrative example on triangulation and corresponding squares. These colored squares that you see on the board are actually the work of Dvoretsky himself and are part of the product. So let's get on with the lesson. This position is very important both for itself and as an illustration of the characteristic logic of analyzing corresponding squares. Okay? Let's deal with the squares of correspondence first. Two pairs of squares of reciprocal Zugzwang are obvious right off. d6, d8 in yellow, and c5, c7 green. The squares d6 and c5 border on d5, and for black, the corresponding squares d8 and c7 border on c8. Thus, a standard means of identifying a new correspondence, that of d5 and c8 squares in red. Now, I'm new to the lesson, so I'm not going to be just rattling off, clarifications because I don't have any. But as I understand it, and we'll find out soon enough if I'm right or wrong, and maybe you'll understand even better. Okay, so we already know that the greens are corresponding squares and the yellows are as well. And we know that the two kings are actually touching each of those corresponding squares. So the black king is touching a green and a yellow square, of course, which are part of corresponding pairs, and the white king as well. And because they're both touching, if I understand this, the corresponding squares of a pair each, their squares are, as a result, corresponding as well. So because they're touching, let's say, a yellow corresponding and a green corresponding, the squares that happen to be touching these, in this case with the king on them, are corresponding as well as a result. Highlighted in red. And yeah, there's no blue or green or purple. Chessbase only has 3 highlighted colors as far as I know. Okay, so along with d5 and c5, which is basically where the king is, that's d5, and c5 is the green square next to him, white has 2 equally important squares, c4 and d4, and these I'll highlight for you. So this is c4 and d4, not to be confused with corresponding squares, just important squares. While black has adjoining the corresponding squares c7 and c8, crap, that was not intentional. Okay. Perfect. Wasn't sure I was going to get the colors right. While black has adjoining the corresponding squares c7 and c8, I'll just move my mouse around it, only one square, d8 or b8. While black's king, with black's king on d8, however, white makes a waiting move with his king from c4 to d4 or the reverse. Black's king will be forced onto c7 or c8 when white occupies the corresponding square and wins. Well, I'm assuming that this will be clear once we play through the example. So, white to move. And by all means, feel free to pause it and try to figure it out on your own. But this isn't normally an exercise. So king c4. And there's a bunch of explanations on the alternatives. We'll go through the main line first. King d8. King d4. And already we have the distant opposition. king c8, king d5. Okay, so remember that we had those corresponding squares by the two kings. We already knew they were corresponding, except that now white has basically managed to pass the move on to black from the same position. He started it with king c4, and now it's black to move from this very same position. So now king d8, king d6, king c8, c7, and yeah, you're zugzwang, you're forced to move away. King b7, king d7, and yeah, you're lost. Okay. And he does add here that after king d5, if you were to try something different, for example, king c7, then king c5, and followed by king b6. And of course, yeah, you'll have all the options are yours. Okay. Now let's go through the example from the starting position so that we can grasp all of the nitty-gritty of that triangulation maneuver. Okay, so what about the other moves, though? Instead of king c4 and king d4, why would they fail? All right, so king d6, king d8. Those are the corresponding squares, as you may recall. Yellow and yellow. And as a result, because it happens to work with black, black has gained the opposition or hasn't lost it in any case. And yeah, unless you break from that grip, it's going to remain a draw. Okay. And if king c5, the other corresponding square, well, king c7. Okay. Let's move on. So here is the second illustrative example in the lesson on triangulation. And it's a position by Hermann Neustadtl. Did I spell it right? Yeah, okay. And it's from 1898, and it looks like a study. So he starts the introduction to this position with the words, find two winning plans. The author's solution to this study involves the opposition which white seizes by his very first move. And there's a lengthy text in the middle of it, which says, in 1968, during a session of training in the calculation of variations, I find pawn endings quite useful for this. Fair enough. I discovered a second solution to this study based on completely different logic. And he then goes on to elaborate on what that solution is. It probably doesn't make a difference because I'm going to be playing through both solutions anyway, but I'm going to start with the original solution that he says is involving the opposition, and then we'll take a look at Dvoretsky's cook, because studies that have an alternate solution are called cooks. Well, the alternate solution is called a cook. And then we'll take a look at it. So if you want to take a look at this on your own, try to figure out one of the solutions at the very least, then by all means, pause the video, study the position, take your time. I don't have that liberty. I have that liberty when he presents exercises, because then he actually gives the blank position with just what you're supposed to do. And the next entry into the database is what will actually show me what the solution was. And then I can really work on it without cheating or peeking. But here, I don't have that option. Okay, so the first move, this is the original solution, is king d4. And he points out that not king e3, which would be a very big mistake. Wouldn't even occur to me to play that, frankly. King e5, exclamation point, king f3, h5. King g3, king e4. Now, this doesn't lose, obviously, for white, but it loses the win. And since you should be able to win this, it still counts as a catastrophic blunder. Okay. So, king d4, king c6, king c4, and he does point out that g5 does not work because of f takes g5. Well, it's Dvoretsky, and considering how meticulous he is about his work, I'll just take his word for it right now. So king c4, king d6, and now is when the point of the study comes to play. King b5, exclamation point. The opposition can only win if it leads to an outflanking. And the move is king d5, exclamation point. He does point out, however, that yes, the outflanking looks risky, but it turns out to be playable because of the following line. If king e5, king c6, king f4, king d6, king takes g4, king e6, and you are winning with white. Not quite a mind square, but close. And also, instead of king f4, you could also try h5, after which g takes h5, king takes f5, king d5 is sufficient. Fair enough. The minute the black king moves to g4, or even f4, well, if you go to f4, then h6 will win. But if you go to g4, then king e6 should be enough. In fact, actually, king g4, h6 again. So, okay, nice. So king b5, king d5, exclamation point. King b6. So white takes the opposition again thanks to his reserve tempo, h4, h5. But first, the enemy king must be decoyed to a bad position as far as possible from the g-pawn. So if he were to play h5 immediately, this would be a mistake because of king e5, king c5, king f4, king d5, king takes g4, king e6, king g5. And now we do have a case of mind square catastrophe. It's interesting that he chooses this particular position with that particular theme right after a chapter on mind squares. I tend to not believe that these are coincidences. So king b6, exclamation point. King d6, king b7. Wow. I never cease to be impressed by these long maneuvers that seem to go all the way behind everything else to come back and win the position in a glorious triumph. So king d7, h5, king d6, king c8, another outflanking, king e5, king d7, king f4, king e6. Nice. So let's take a look at the original solution. Well, sorry, Dvoretsky's alternate solution and how it works, because he says he got there by completely different logic. And that should be more than a little interesting. So here's the original position with king d4 winning. But instead, and now I'm going to begin to read his longer explanation, which I glossed over in the beginning. The d5 square is key here. Okay. With white's king at d5 and black's at d7, white wins by h4, h5. Okay, let's set that up. Without any, forcing it to happen, let's just see what happens. So yeah, so it's like king d4, 7, king d5, king d7. And here, this is just his explanation. H5 would win. Yeah, it seems pretty obvious, actually. Black doesn't have any options. Black would be forced to come here, and then, of course, you have the famous outflanking body blow. Okay. Simple enough, but that doesn't mean that you can actually force that position. Just that this is something that black would have to avoid. But he's saying that this is possible to force, and therefore is the key to his alternate solution. Okay. So, by the way, with the pawn already on h5, occupying the d5 square is no longer decisive. The key squares are now on the 6th rank, c6, d6, and e6. Which leads us to an important conclusion. When the pawn structure changes, the system of key squares associated with the position generally changes too, just as with the system of corresponding squares. Fair enough. With white's king at f4, black must deal with the threat of g4, g5. It can be parried by putting the black king at e7, but not f7. Since then, white will occupy the square d5. Which immediately gives us two pairs of corresponding squares, f4 and e7 and e4, d6. Okay, so f4, e7, and e4 and d6. Whoa. So next to these, white has two equivalent squares, f3 and e3. We got these colors right. f3 and e3. And black, meanwhile, has only one, because, of course, e6 is covered by the pawn. Thus, the winning mechanism becomes clear: triangulation. So not king d4, the original solution. Instead, king f4 with the idea of g5, king e7, king f3, king d7, king e3, king d6, and of course, you can guess the rest, king d4. King e4 gaining the triangulation of the corresponding squares, which he showed us earlier. King e4, king c6, king f4, king d6, and now g5 wins. Now, he does say that after king e3, if instead of king d6 trying to forestall the obvious, if you were to try king e7, Then king f4, king f7. We already know that king d6 will allow g5, as in the main line of his particular solution. And if king f7, king e4, king e7, king d5, king d7, h5, and we have gained the other key solution. Fascinating. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. And again, I suggest that if you had trouble following this, and remember, this is Dvoretsky, then by all means, go back in the video, play it over again, see if it makes more sense little by little. I suggest that maybe more exercises or more examples will help illustrate this. And finally, trying to solve his famous exercises, well, then we will really be able to get our hands dirty and trying to understand and solve these. And sometimes that's the best way. This is the last illustrative example in the lesson on triangulation by Dvoretsky. After this, we'll be looking at the exercises, which I will leave to the next video. In the meantime, we have a position from a game between Leonid Yudasin, or Yudasin, and Vyacheslav Osnos, Leningrad, 1987. And Dvoretsky comments, with his last move, king e2, f2, Yudasin offered a draw, adding that the position was a well-known draw, which one might find in any book. His opponent, an international master and an experienced trainer, since he had trained Viktor Korchnoi for many years, believed him and accepted his offer. However, it's a win. And be very careful what your opponent says, no matter what his rating or title might be. It's perfectly possible that Yudasin was not actually trying to pull a quick one on his opponent, that he actually believed what he said. So I'm not going to automatically accuse him of, let's say, sneakiness. But if he did and his opponent took his word for it, then all the power to Yudasin as well. So, yeah, nobody's forcing him to accept a draw or for his opponent to believe him. So how does he win? Now, if you'd like to put it on pause and take a look at this position before I play through the solution, by all means. So black to play and win, not draw. King e4, king e2, f4, king f2, f3. And we reach a position which is indeed in all endgame books. This is actually a carbon copy of that position we saw earlier on, which is why he brings this up now, between Fahrni and Alapin. Except, of course, the colors are inverted, but it's identical. And therefore black wins by triangulation. King f1, king f5, king e1, king e5, king f1, king e4, and of course we have triangulated the position, and you may recall the solution after that. So that wraps up the lesson on triangulation. Take a look at these positions and the lesson again if you are a little bit hesitant, because in my experience, Dvoretsky always manages to pull these exact positions in some way or another and put them into his exercises. And I expect no different this time. So look at this position, understand the method, the mechanics of how to triangulate, identifying the corresponding squares, which is, of course, the first step. Then after you've done that, how you can triangulate it so that you can reach those same squares, but with the tempo lost, or let's put it, say, the color switched to the other side to move. In any case, thank you for joining me in this fascinating lesson on triangulation by Dvoretsky. I hope you'll join me in my next video. And in the meantime, well, happy chess and good mates.